Hey guys, in response to Cameron Bertuzzi's criticisms of the Book of Abraham, our boy Luke Hansen made a video. Check it out.
Be the best, you gotta beat the best.
Cameron Bertuzzi from the YouTube channel Capturing Christianity has been on a bit of a Mormon spree as of late. So it was only a matter of time before he put out this video.
From an unbiased, objective perspective, the evidence overwhelmingly suggests Joseph Smith's Book of Abraham wasn't translated at all. It was fabricated.
Overall, the video is actually pretty good, at least compared to previous videos where he completely made up history.
Joseph Smith wasn't exactly living on crumbs either. Let's just say that a lot of wealth ended up in Joseph Smith's pocket. It actually looks a lot like the contemporary prosperity gospel movement.
I don't even know. I don't know where he got that. No idea, but good job on improving on this one, Cameron. I have one more compliment for you before I jump in. This video provides a good overview of the arguments I've heard against the Book of Abraham, and it packages them into a lean and well-edited video. Honestly, it's the best Book of Abraham video on the internet in terms of watchability. But it also contains many of the bad assumptions and errors that I've seen in other treatments of the Book of Abraham. This makes a debunk of Cameron's video a great vehicle for educating ourselves on the Book of Abraham. So, let's first go through Cameron's main points, and then give you the information that he left out. In 1835, a traveling exhibitor named Michael Chandler arrived in Kirtland, Ohio, the bustling headquarters of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In his possession were some mummies and papyri. Joseph Smith and the Saints quickly became fascinated with these ancient artifacts and purchased them from Chandler. This event would lead to the publication and canonization of what Latter-day Saints call the Book of Abraham. Here's how Cameron explains what happened.
How did Joseph Smith supposedly translate these papyrus fragments that contained Egyptian hieroglyphs, which were still a mystery in America? The answer lies in the notebooks he kept, the so-called Egyptian alphabet and grammar documents. In these pages, Smith and his scribes lined up Egyptian symbols from the scrolls, then wrote out entire English paragraphs alongside them. He insisted this was a divinely guided translation, the same method he'd used to produce the Book of Mormon just a few years earlier.
This is a bit of sleight of hand from Cameron. Joseph Smith claimed that the Book of Abraham was both a translation and revelation from heaven, but he made no such statement about the Egyptian alphabet and grammar. Smith also never claimed that he used the Egyptian alphabet and grammar for the Book of Abraham translation. We don't even have a record that a single person involved with the Egyptian Papers project made that claim. We know that Joseph Smith wasn't directly involved in all the Egyptian-related papers from Kirtland because he wasn't even in Kirtland when some of them were written. This doesn't make sense if these papers are supposed to be the product of Smith's unique divine translation abilities. According to Dr. Carrie Muhlestein, the leading expert on the topic, the historical record suggests Joseph wasn't even the one most involved in the alphabet and grammar project, and it was instead W. Phelps.
And Joseph may have been involved in this. We know he's aware of it and looks at it from time to time, but we don't know how involved. Maybe he's heavily involved, maybe he's not involved at all. It seems like it's mostly a W. Phelps project. But anyway, he creates this larger thing that's called the Grammar and Alphabet of the Egyptian Language. And many people have supposed that Joseph uses that to translate the Book of Abraham. The problem is that it makes no sense at all.
Funnily enough, Cameron included an image in his video that supports Muhlestein's conclusion.
And next to each symbol are entire paragraphs of English translation. Here's why this is a big deal.
It's a letter from W. Phelps to his wife, containing characters with proposed pronunciations and translations next to them. So, obviously, not a paper of Joseph Smith. But here's the really crazy part. This letter was written weeks before the Saints learned the papyri even existed. There's a better explanation for the Egyptian alphabet and grammar and the rest of the Kirtland papers. That is, that they were a secular attempt by Phelps and others, including Joseph Smith, to translate ancient languages that began before the arrival of Chandler's papyri. These men tried to accomplish this in part by reverse engineering the Book of Abraham to its source text. Cameron seems unaware of these and other problems with his claim about the Kirtland Egyptian papers. He simply assumes that they are the source of the Book of Abraham translation, and he repeatedly bases his arguments throughout the video on this weak assumption.
The very existence of these translation manuscripts undercuts the notion that he never meant it as a literal translation.
Cameron does get around to critiquing the Book of Abraham translation directly when he turns his attention to the Facsimiles.
In 1912, Episcopal Bishop F.S. Spalding mailed the Book of Abraham Facsimiles to 8 recognized Egyptologists. Their responses were devastating. Breasted politely but firmly dismissed Smith's claims as uninformed. The legendary Flinders Petrie said that there was not one single word of truth in Smith's explanations.
Did you catch where those quotes were from? 1912. Over 100 years ago, when Egyptology was much less developed. Later we'll see that contrary to Dr. Petrie's assertion, Joseph Smith gets multiple things right in the Facsimiles. But first we need to understand how we should approach the Facsimiles. Generally, translation is pretty simple, if you know the source and target languages. Symbols, however, are harder to pin down and can vary widely in meaning across time and culture. Egyptologist John Gee has said, "Interpretation of illustrations is one of the most difficult parts of understanding Egyptian texts. A given symbol can have many different meanings, and trying to decide which one the author of the text was trying to convey is at times nearly impossible. Moreover, in many instances, we simply don't yet know what some symbols mean." So, can Egyptologists accurately interpret Joseph Smith's facsimiles? Well, most of what Egyptologists know about Egyptian symbols come from around 1200 BC, but the Joseph Smith papyri were produced in 200 BC, at a time when many cultures were mixing together, including Jews. Egyptians and other polytheists were very willing to assimilate new characters and gods into their beliefs and texts, including stories and characters from the Old Testament. In fact, a study of over 750 Egyptian texts found many references to biblical figures, with Abraham and Moses being the most mentioned. Additionally, most of these texts came from Thebes, the very location where the Joseph Smith papyri originated. Not only did these characters show up, but we have some examples of them being used in contexts similar to the explanations given by Joseph Smith. For example, Cameron claims the lion couch scene in Facsimile 1 does not refer to Abraham. But we have at least one example of Abraham being associated with the figure lying on a lion couch very similar to the one in Facsimile 1. There are more examples of this happening.
So do we have like other examples of Jews doing that kind of thing in Egypt around this time period, around 200 BC?
I think so. Some of them are, it's a little bit hard to tell who is doing it. Is it an Egyptian or a Jew? So I'll give you an example. There's a scene that is typically thought of as, in fact, it's very similar to Facsimile 3, where Osiris is on a throne. In these scenes, typically that's how we'd interpret it. Osiris is on a throne, and someone is being brought to be in Osiris's presence. But we find a number of these where what is labeled, instead of it being Osiris on the throne, it's labeled as being Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And someone is being brought into Abraham's presence, right? Which is very similar to what's on Facsimile 3.
Yeah.
The person on the throne is interpreted as Abraham, right? So is that an Egyptian who has adopted some Jewish perspectives, or is that a Jew who's adopted an Egyptian drawing? I don't know. And it may be some of both. I mean, there are plenty of examples of these. So there are all sorts of things we have to kind of think through as we approach it.
We even have examples of Christ himself repurposing Egyptian stories with Jewish characters. In Luke 16, Jesus tells the story of a beggar named Lazarus and a rich man. When they both die, the rich man is tormented, while Lazarus is at peace in Abraham's bosom. Most scholars agree Jesus is repackaging an Egyptian story, in which a magician shows his father the fate of a rich man and a poor man after their death. The rich man is tormented, while the poor man is elevated to a high rank and is placed by Osiris. Once again, we see Abraham related with Osiris, which is exactly what we see in Joseph Smith's explanations of Facsimile 1 and 3. These correlations don't fit well with the theory that Joseph Smith completely made up interpretations of Egyptian art. But does all this prove that Joseph Smith gave an accurate 2nd century BC Theban explanation of the facsimiles? No. No, it does not. We don't even know if Joseph Smith intended to give the original meaning of the facsimiles in his explanations. Maybe he was giving the interpretation Jews in the area later gave for them, or perhaps they were Smith's own inspired interpretation. We just don't know. So Cameron and Latter-day Saints have to be careful not to overstate their case. Now, I wish Cameron had just moved on to his next argument, but he uses the church's response to these experts in 1912 to weave a story about how the church wants its members to remain ignorant of the science.
In February 1913, the church's first presidency published a letter in the Improvement era. They insisted these scholars were simply biased and lacked the spiritual insight to judge Scripture. Essentially, they brushed off top Egyptologists as people who just didn't get it because they weren't Mormons.
Cameron completely misrepresents the church's response here. That edition of the Improvement era contained multiple articles with page after page of analysis and responses to the claims made by the experts. And that first presidency letter he mentioned, the quote he put on the screen wasn't even from the first presidency. It was from Dr. Frederick J. Pack, a professor of geology at the University of Utah. Roll next clip.
In 1966, curators at the Metropolitan Museum of Art discovered fragments of papyrus that once belonged to Joseph Smith. Modern Egyptologists could directly study the exact scrolls from which Joseph claimed to have translated the Book of Abraham. And surprise, surprise, every expert determined that these were not Abraham's writings at all.
The fragments Cameron's talking about include portions of the facsimiles and some of the surrounding text. Now, Cameron assumes that the text had to have been the text Joseph Smith claimed to translate, and therefore we have the text he translated. But we have 3 reasons to believe that this is not a good assumption. First, in Egyptian papyri, the text correlates to the picture next to it only about 50% of the time. Even modern textbooks don't always manage to place figures next to the text they reference. Second, Abraham 1:12 says, "I will refer you to the representation at the commencement of this record," which suggests the picture and the text were not next to each other. Third, perhaps the strongest point, is that witness accounts agree that the Book of Abraham was on only one of the rolls of papyrus Joseph purchased. It is estimated that we only have about 2 to 3% of the papyri originally in Joseph's possession. So it's convenient for Cameron to assume we have the exact papyri Joseph translated, but chances are we probably don't. Cameron's final argument against the Book of Abraham has to do with its contents.
It introduces radical new ideas that clash with mainstream Judaism and Christianity. So let me show you just a couple examples. All right, so number 1, the gods in the creation story, Abraham 4:1. In this verse, Joseph Smith depicts the gods shaping and planning creation, a far cry from the singular, all-powerful God of the Bible. This verse and others like it turn Abraham, literally the father of monotheism, into a polytheist. Number 2, pre-mortal existence and intelligences. Abraham 3:22 through 23. This doctrine, if we can call it one, is found nowhere in canonical Jewish or mainstream Christian scriptures.
This is a compelling line, and Cameron is great at selling it. But it's a massive simplification of the complex theological histories of both Judaism and Christianity. If throughout all of history, Jews were strict monotheists and never ever recognized other gods, then why is Trent Horn, Cameron's fellow Catholic apologist, saying this?
The earliest parts of the Old Testament affirm henotheism, the belief that there are many gods, but only one God should be worshipped, Yahweh. We see this in passages like Psalm 97:9. Thou art exalted far above all gods.
The idea of human preexistence is not foreign to the Bible either. In Romans, Paul writes, "Those of us whom God took knowledge from eternity, he also foreordained." The renowned Jesuit priest and professor of biblical studies at the Catholic University of America, Joseph A. Fitzmyer, points out that the original Greek of this verse implies that God had a more than speculative knowledge of man, but rather that he knew us with affection or predilection. Christian biblical scholar Robert G. Hamerton Kelly wrote, "The idea of pre-existence is deeply embedded in the biblical traditions. If anything, Cameron should be concerned that his own concept of creation ex nihilo didn't come about until 200 years after Jesus' death. So Cameron is just outright wrong. These are not made-up doctrines unknown to canonical Jews and Christians. However, he's not wrong when he points out that Joseph Smith likely didn't get these ideas from Christians of his day. But this is a point in favor of Joseph Smith. How exactly did he produce scripture that aligned with biblical traditions unknown to him if he was simply a fraudster? In fact, the Book of Abraham contains many historical details that Joseph Smith got right that Cameron never even mentions. I would say he was trying to hide them from his audience, but I'm not sure he even knows about them. This is not the way to analyze the truth claims of any religion or academic topic. It's also a really bad look for Cameron, because one of the main points in his video is that the church is trying to hide information about the Book of Abraham. He even put it on the thumbnail. That guy looks familiar. Anyway, here are 5 things Cameron Bertuzzi doesn't want you to know about the Book of Abraham. First, Joseph Smith predicted the existence of a plain called Olashem. Later, a record of King Hansen was discovered that dated to a little before the time of Abraham and listed a place called Ulasum in Syria near Abraham's homeland. Now, in Semitic languages, O and U are sometimes exchanged, as well as the S and Sh sounds, making Olashem and Ulasum a perfect linguistic match. The correlation is so good that even non-LDS scholar Christopher Wood grudgingly admitted, certainly Ulasum could be superficially linked on phonetic grounds to the Olashem in the Book of Abraham. Olashem is an amazing match, geographically, chronologically, and phonetically. Second, the Book of Abraham calls the sun Shinha. Later, the pyramid texts show that Shinha is a plausible rendering for the word they used to describe the sun's orbit during Abraham's time. The text also shows they used a different word just after Abraham's time, and it was the more commonly used word. Joseph Smith didn't just get the name right, he even got the chronology right. Third, the original manuscript for the Book of Abraham says a woman named Zepta discovered Egypt when it was underwater, which aligns with some Egyptian texts that say Isis discovered Egypt rising out of the water. But Isis and Zepta aren't the same, right? True, but some Egyptian texts name Isis as the daughter of Ptah. And in the time period Joseph Smith's papyri were written, Zepta would mean daughter of Ptah. Fourth, the Book of Abraham adds many biographical details to Abraham's life that are not found in the Bible. These include his idolatrous father, an attempt on his life from which he was miraculously delivered, his interest in astronomy which he taught the Egyptians, and the fact that he wrote his own book. All of these biographical points show up repeatedly in ancient apocryphal writings and even historians' writings. Fifth, Joseph Smith assigns the correct interpretation to many figures in the Facsimiles, unlike what Dr. Petrie said earlier. In Facsimile 2, Joseph correctly says that 4 figures represent the 4 corners of the earth. In Facsimile 1, he correctly calls vertical lines the pillars of heaven, the exact phrase used by the Egyptians. He calls angled lines the firmament over our head, and a crocodile, Pharaoh. Both are correct. In light of this, is it reasonable to assume that Joseph Smith was lucky enough to get all this right? For those who say yes, I have a question. How much money are you willing to bet that you can guess the name of an ancient Syrian geographical feature, the name of a celestial body as it was called by the Egyptians, character names in ancient Egyptian stories, the interpretation of multiple figures on a hypocephaly, details about Abraham's life that would not show up in later discoveries, and doctrines unknown to you, but present in ancient Judaism? I'm willing to bet that Cameron and other critics wouldn't put much money on that bet. Hopefully by now, you can see that the strength of Cameron's arguments lie mostly in his assumptions about the facts, not in the facts themselves. Despite what Cameron and others say, the Book of Abraham is not an obvious fraud or a joke. From a secular standpoint, we have good reasons to believe the Book of Abraham has real ancient elements. But a spiritual approach is what matters. I can understand why appealing to spiritual witness may seem like a cop-out sometimes, but people of all faiths understand there will always be complexities to work through. It's a complex topic, and as a seeker of truth, I am very grateful I can find out what is true without becoming an Egyptologist and church historian and theologian. We don't have all the answers, and sometimes the best answers we do have are unsatisfying. For example, it's possible that none of the papyri had the Book of Abraham on them. They might have been a catalyst for revelation, and Joseph wrongfully assumed he was receiving a translation of the papyri themselves. Now, Christians may scoff at that excuse, but remember that Trent Horn clip?
They were true authors, and that means God allowed their personalities and their ancient worldviews to be present in what they wrote. This means in their writings, we see a worldview that is less advanced, not just scientifically, but also theologically.
What's a bigger issue? That Joseph didn't know where he got the Book of Abraham from? Or that for hundreds of years, Jews had the wrong conception of God and even wrote it into the Bible? I know which one I'd pick. Well, we made it. I hope I've helped you gain secular knowledge of the Book of Abraham. But the good stuff, the spiritual knowledge, is up to you. I encourage you to do the work to gain it. Let's keep this discussion going in the comments. What did I miss, and where did I go wrong? I'm Luke Hansen, and as always, as Carden says, for this and more, check us out at wardradio.com.
Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. We assume if you made it this far that you liked our content, so please make sure you like this video and you share it with your friends. Now, in order to keep this content flowing freely, we need your help. If you're a person of means, please check us out on Venmo, the Cash App, or Zelle and consider a direct contribution to the channel. Or you could always go to wardradio.com and sign up for our newsletter there. And while you're there, maybe consider purchasing some merch. We have some really cool hats, some really cool shirts, so you can strut your stuff and support the channel that way. Or if you're a kind of person that wants to just help out with some of the equipment in the studio, we have an Amazon wish list linked in the description as well. And don't forget scripturenotes.com. You have to read your scriptures daily, and scripturenotes.com is frankly the coolest way to study your scriptures, and they're a very generous sponsor of this channel. So please consider a free trial with scripturenotes.com. The link to Scripture Notes will also be in the description of this video. Either way, whether you're pressing this little button right here to subscribe to our channel and share it with your friends, or whether you are actually hitting this button right here just to watch another video, we look forward to seeing you in the next program.